Well, thank you, Professor Kennedy. It's a pleasure, complete pleasure and honor to be here and to have this experience of being part of the festivities that accompany opening this adventure with New York University here in Abu Dhabi. It is, the optimism is infectious, and the melding of the past with the future is palpable, what's going on here. And I was thinking, driving around this incredible city, seeing the plans at the palace the other night for what is still to come, I was thinking of the metaphor of the computer and the software, the hardware and the software. So there's obviously been tremendous effort in the last 30 years building the hardware, the buildings, the facilities, the universities, the schools, the hospitals, the government infrastructure and all that. And yet that's the hardware, and then the interesting part and the fun part, because we're all interactive humans, is the software, the ideas, the values, the morals that a culture adopts to fill those buildings. The buildings aren't anything without the interaction of what happens in the educative system and in the area of ideas and how you want to live your life. So it is great to be here, and it's great to see this process going forward. Now, Professor Kennedy, just in that wonderful introduction, which I'll remember, also summarized my first slide. So I was going to speak about an aspect of one of the topics covered, as he pointed out, in this book. But I wanted to tell a little bigger issue, which is that bioethics, the field of how biology impacts ethical issues, has been a traditional field for many, many years, and it has dealt with certain things like organ transplantation, where people need a liver or a kidney or a heart or what have you, and more people need it than there are available those organs. And so their ethics rose up to say, well, how do we choose between Jones and Smith here as to who gets the available heart? And a whole vast industry started, starting roughly around the 1960s in the United States. And as I said, that was bioethics. And then over the last 10, 15 years, with the strong emergence of the neuroscience and the development of neuroscience and understanding how the brain is involved in our behavior and our cognition and lots of other things relevant to ethics, people say, well, you know, the nervous system itself and where it stands on these issues is a very important issue, and it almost deserves its own subtitle. So the term neuroethics was developed, and let me just put up here, because he's already mentioned them, the various things that were addressed in the book move all the way from the moral status of the embryo. The issue is when do you want to confer moral status on the embryo with relation to stem cell and biomedical cloning. The notion of pregenetic diagnosis, where people are more and more using in vitro analysis, in vitro fertilization for in developing pregnancy, but then the techniques that are available to check and choose which embryos use, one can begin to see parents kind of crafting which embryo is the one they prefer, whether the child will have height or blonde hair or brunette hair or what have you, athletic skills or not, and so forth. But do we want a society where that's really an option, or do you want to just be involved in unbidden love of whatever is given to you is what you develop as part of your family? And other issues on the memory enhancer, eraser issue, as mentioned, these are large issues. Do you really want to have the capacity, someone comes in and says, you know, I really had a rotten year, a rotten month, or a rotten week, and I'm really depressed by it. Well, just take this pill and we'll erase it. And then the idea is you then don't have that bad memory bugging you. Well, maybe there should be bad memories bugging you. I mean, if you did something that was anxiety-filling, it may help control the rest of your life so that you don't behave in a particular way in the future, and so forth. But the issue that we'll talk about today focus in on is the one that everybody has an opinion on and is interested in, and particularly I remember in my college years that this is the first college session that really kept everybody up at night, talking about determinism and free will, and what does that mean for how you run your society. So this issue keeps popping up, and it's always with us, and it's had a long history. That's just the book. So it's had a long history in the world, and Lucretius, in his famous On the Nature of Things, thought about it. The idea of determinism isn't particularly new. The idea that one thing causes another obviously has been around for a long time, and people thought about it and worried about it. And Lucretius, as you can see from this quote, writes, again, if all movement is interconnected, the new arising from the old in a determinate order, if the atoms never swerve, he was thinking already about atoms, if the atoms never swerve so as to originate some new movement that will snap the bonds of fate, the everlasting sequence of cause and effects, what is the source of free will possessed by living things throughout the earth? He's already bugged by it, as we say. If there's this determinate thing, I feel free. I'm freely choosing my actions here. What are we going to do about this if these atoms never swerve? So he came up with, he solved the problem. The atoms swerve. He just asserted it and said that's the way it is, and he slept better at night. So there you go. So the notion is it's across centuries, it is with us, and it is something that I think everybody in this room actively or passively thinks about all the time. And bringing it up to modern times, Sir Francis Crick, the Watson Crick and the discoverer of DNA, wrote about it before he died a few years ago, and just made the observation that there's an undeniable feeling that free will is free. It's here, it's with us, we're choosing, and so forth. But he tied it to that the only way we're going to solve this is by really understanding how brain enables consciousness. And then he says when we get there, the explanation of free will is likely to be easier to solve. Well, I think there's truth to that, and what I'm going to try to say in the next bit of time here is to try to give you a sense of one perspective of that question. So these are not idle musings and only for, as we say, bullroom discussions, sitting around trying to figure out the meaning of life. It has an impact on how we think about ourselves and our society if we believe the world is determined and we're sort of just along for the ride free or not. And three psychologists, Sheriff Josh Green and Jonathan Schooler, did this very clever experiment that shows how these matters impact our thinking. And what they did was take a group of students and have them read a essay by Francis Crick, as a matter of fact, that was very deterministic sounding, that we're determined, we're just a march step along in life. And they had another group of students read another passage that didn't have that feeling. It was very open-ended and casual. And then both groups then had a task. And the task was to administer the degree of punishment to somebody who had committed some horrible crime. Okay? Well, guess what? The people that believed that the world was determined, that sort of their world is blameless, gave far lesser punishment to the offender than people who thought that everybody sort of freely chose what happened. They gave a far more severe punishment. So if we come to believe that we really have few options because we're in this march step of determinism, how we mete out our justice will be affected. And you come to the realization, as the philosophers put it and point out to you in a very simple phrase, the people, we, are the law. It's the mean view. Our norms, our values that are established through our culture are going to pretty much be the source for the laws that any culture has. So if we come to think of think of ourselves, our human societies in a particular way, that can't help but impact how we set the laws so that our cultures run? So these are important questions, and it's important to think about them. Now, the effects on culture and on can be seen in simple cognitive perceptual experiments. And a series of experiments done by very clever psychologists in the United States, the University of Michigan, Richard Nisbet, are really kind of striking. And they're very simple experiments. He shows students of two different cultures. This was an American culture and an Asian culture. Shows the students this picture, and then after he shows it to them, they're asked to write down what they saw and express what they saw. And it turns out Americans react one way. They focus on the big fish. That's the only thing they seem to see in this picture is the fish, right? Whereas when you give the same side to the same age group and so forth of people in an Asian culture, they attend to the entire scene. They see the relative, not the absolute. They see the relative relationship of all the stimuli, and that's what they remember. So it affects their cognition and memory. And as I said, it's detected by their subsequent descriptions of what they saw. So you have this interesting issue of two different cultures coming at a simple picture, and when being asked to subsequently recount what the picture is, the cultures respond in a different way. Well, it was just a matter of time before the brain guys say, well, does that impact the brain? Can we see some effect of this on the brain? And a group at MIT, headed by John Gabrielli, did that experiment. I won't go into the details, but basically they take this fish experiment and convert it into a task that requires a judgment of an absolute judgment, just tell us what you see, or a relative judgment, take into account all the things in the tank, just to kind of do it. And then they put people in the brain scanner and they figure out, is their brain really behaving differently under these two tasks? And what they discover is that yes, it is. That for the East Asian students, on the absolute task where you have to focus in on one item, you see the brain more active. Those little white and those little red and yellow spots show brain activity. Whereas on the relative task, their brain isn't very active because it's just easy. They know how to do that. And it's just the opposite for the American group. The American group, they don't see the context. What they see is the big fish, so their brain isn't active at all at the big fish, and so forth. So you get the idea. So you can just see the implications and the power of what becomes accepted as a view of how you think of yourself as human even seems to be passed into the very functioning of the brain. So there's been this march towards determinism in the West and throughout the world, with Copernicus pointing out that maybe everything doesn't revolve around the Earth, maybe the world things revolve around the sun, and then you have Newton coming along and developing his laws of motion and really giving the whole notion of determinism, and there's an orderly process in the world that can explain everything. And then you have Darwin coming along with his theories of natural selection and the evolution, and Einstein with his theory of relativity was a very strict determinist. And then you come into the modern era of neuroscience, where people on a daily basis are finding out more neural mechanisms that are involved for particular aspects of behavior and cognition. And they think, oh, this means that things are really determined. And so over the years, these have been argued about in philosophical circles and in scientific circles. And the views on tight determinism, really hard determinism, were articulated in length by the philosopher Spinoza. He wrote, "There is no mind absolute or free will, but the mind is determined for willing this or that by a cause, which is determined in turn by another cause, and this one again by another, and so on infinity." There's just this domino effect. It's just there, it's going on, and we're all part of it. And Einstein made the observation that human freedom in the philosophical sense, I am definitely a disbeliever. Everybody acts not only under external compulsion, but also in accordance with inner necessity. So, this view is, you really think about it, it's kind of, geez, really? You guys really think that? Think of this. Here is, I once had the last few months, I had to give a talk somewhere, and in front of the podium, they put a clock, and they basically are telling you when to stop, right? We've had enough of you when this hits 0. And it's very unnerving to be lecturing and have this charge in you. But the metaphor here is that these full determinists basically would say that the moment you're born, you could be given a watch. And on that watch would be the time left you have to live. And you wouldn't have to, it would take all the guesswork out of things, right? Because the clock knows, because it's determined, and somehow they've gotten a fancy system to be able to figure out what it is for you, slip it into the clock and give it to you as you leave the hospital. Well, it just doesn't seem right. It doesn't feel right. And it's just weird. And so that's why people continue to challenge this. And then along came the challenge to classic physics, which came from quantum mechanics. And the notion here was that really understanding atomic interactions in a way that were beginning to be understood, you could not predict Newtonian laws from understanding all one could understand about the interactions of atoms. And so the revolutionary idea came across that things really are not determined, but things happen in a probabilistic way. There's a probability there'll be the next step. There's not a determination, and so forth. And so Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist, using this commonly used distinction between atoms and billiard balls, that you could have all the information in the world about the atoms, but you could never predict how the billiard balls, in fact, interact the way we know they interact at the second level of description of Newtonian mechanics. So Niels Bohr stepped up to the plate and said that the renunciation of the ideal of causality in atomic physics has been forced upon us. And then Werner Heisenberg, the famous German physicist, I believe that indeterminism, that is necessary and not just consistently possible. So all that's a way of saying, well, maybe things aren't so determined. There's this wiggle room that's provided by this difference in between the atomic level and the mechanical level. And finally, I mean, it's just the view. And finally, Richard Feynman, who was a professor of physics at Caltech when I was there, and used to stop you in the hallway and kind of throw you up against the wall and say, "So what are you doing lately? You know, give me your story." Brilliant man, fun guy. And he writes, "Yes, physics has given up. We do not know to predict what would happen in a given circumstance, and we believe now that it is impossible, that the only thing that can be predicted is the probability of different events. This is a retrenchment in our earlier ideal of understanding nature. It may be a backward step. That is, it is impossible to beat the puzzle. That is the way nature really is." So this was a kind of a giving up that the atomic nature of the world would ultimately, through a construction process, one would be able to understand why you can remember your home phone number, basically, going up through all these levels of organization. And it immediately, people said, so down with determinism and up with the idea of emergence. And Philip Anderson, in 1972, wrote a famous paper where he pointed out the reductionist hypothesis does not by any means imply a constructionist one. And this is the interesting way he phrased it. The ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the ability to start from those fundamental laws and reconstruct upwardly the universe. Is a very grand end. And Robert Laughlin, the Nobel laureate from Stanford, physicist, What we're seeing is a transformation of worldview in which the objective of understanding nature by breaking it down to ever smaller parts, that's kind of what the physicists are doing. They're looking for those fundamental laws under the atoms, is supplanted by the objective of understanding how nature actually organizes itself. There's an emergence. There's a different level of description as you go up the ladder. So particle physics exists, and it has a way of proper description, a language of description. Atomic processes have their proper language of description. So does chemistry, biology, cell biology, physiology. Right up the ladder, you get this change in how you would capture the level of organization that you're interested in, and how you would describe it, and the laws that govern that. And you probably should only very carefully say how the laws at a lower level are actually generating the phenomenon you see at a higher level. And this becomes particularly strong and interesting, of course, when you're trying to see how the brain, the top level of physiology there, actually generates the mental states that you and I enjoy. And along with that is that once you recognize that there are these emergent levels that come as you build up the system that you're approaching, there's also a downward effect. It's called downward causation, where these higher levels of organization constrain the very elements that produced the level we're talking about. So these ideas are all fine, and they're all debated at length in the philosophical literature. But the question is that if we're interested in this mind-brain connection, does physics and all that stuff really matter? And the answer is probably no, it doesn't matter at all. It's nice, it's interesting, it's about the nature of life. But physics does not matter. And the question is, therefore, well, does the nervous system, at the level that we're understanding it and examining it, does it work in a predictable Newtonian way? Are there principles of the nervous system that you can state that would say that the system works in a very automatic and determined way? And that's where neuroscience comes in and joins in and says, well, a lot of people think, yes, that's where we'll get to someday. So here's your brain. Here's your brain, 24/7 brain. That's a functional, dynamic functional image of a brain through time. And you just see it's bubbling away. It's bubbling away right now as you sit in your seat. It's changing its metabolic states, what it's focusing on, and all the rest. And the question is this brain really, can we say that we can find the laws of the neurophysiology to explain our mental states? And this takes us right, and I want to put this disclaimer in as I get to the other parts. This is the hardest problem in science. Hardest problem in science. We already have a model for this hardest problem in science. And it is the model of trying to figure out how we think about the hardware-software distinction. So think about it. In fact, we have a computer which is highly specified, and we know exactly how that computer, what it is and how it works. And we also have software that we put into the computer to make it do the tricks that we want it to do. But what we don't understand, and we have not yet developed a language for, is what happens and how do we develop a vocabulary that explains the interaction between the hardware and the software. That interaction of layers, where one layer is animating the other. Software doesn't mean anything without the computer, and the computer doesn't mean anything without the software. And so when you see them interacting and you say, well, how does that thing produce a PowerPoint slide? And what level of description are you going to use? How do you think about that thing between the various layers that are present in that? That is a tough problem. And really, nobody in the world is on it yet, has got it down. It's the same problem when you try to figure out how do the neurons, when they're all firing off, produce the cognition we have, and how do we talk about that with respect to mental states and actual behavior? We need a vocabulary. We need an abstraction, a way of talking about that, and we don't have it yet. So this raises, I'm getting a little, because we have so many students here tonight, I want to reveal the fact that we don't understand a lot of these things, because it's your generation that's supposed to follow these things up and get them. So that I don't have answers is the opportunity for you to go forward and solve these problems. So the old ideas of causation that were triggered off and summarized by Hume, which is basically, if this happens before that, there's a causal relation for it. And that works. We use it all the time. And it's worked for 100 years. But really, that's just an idea probably generated by our language, because as everything is physics and atoms, and when this table stops my hand, it's a bunch of atoms interacting, and what is the cause of that sound you hear? It's atoms interacting, and so physics just said, forget the causation thing. It doesn't have any meaning. And well, what do you mean? Well, so Howard Patty, who's a control engineer in the United States, gets you thinking about this. He says, the common everyday meaning of the concept of causation is entirely pragmatic. What does he mean by that? Well, we use the word cause for events that might be controllable. The value of the concept of causation lies in its identification of where our power and control can be effective. For example, while it is true that bacteria and mosquitoes follow the laws of physics, we do not usually say that malaria is caused by the law of physics, the universal cause. That is because we hope to control bacteria and mosquitoes, not the laws of physics. So what we mean by causation is referring to things that we've grouped in a way that we can have influence over. But it's not the actual mechanism of why one thing is happening and another thing is happening in relation to it. And so when being aware of this, it's good to be aware of that larger issue as you then go into the business of trying to actually figure out how the brain is involved in these various cognitive states, again, that you and I enjoy. So let me just tell you just a couple little samples of why neuroscience is feeling confident that it's going to figure these things out. It's collecting data, and it's going to do stuff that will be intriguing to all of us. And an example here I use comes from my own research. If you look at that picture there, and you fixate in the middle there on that little dot, you will read the word potent, and you instantly see it as potent. Well, in fact, as the students learned yesterday, the way that shakes out is that the word is projected sort of in a funny way to your brain. The POT part of it, the part in the left visual field, actually goes to your right hemisphere of your brain. And the ENT part goes to the left hemisphere. So if you're looking, as you see in the cartoon there, you sort of really have this ENT going to the left hemisphere and POT is going to the right. How does it get together to have this perception of potent, of a single word? Well, through the years, in the last 10 years in particular, it's been discovered that there's a little system in the left hemisphere called the word form area. It's where it puts together all the elements that are seen in the sensory sphere, and the word is somehow assembled, and there's the sensation and perception of the unified word. That means information has got to get, obviously, from the right brain over to the left brain. And can we track that? Can we test that? Is that true, or are we just all making this stuff up? So very clever people decide to test it. And what they do is they have people just like you and me. This is all done on normal subjects. They fixate a point, and then they flash stimuli in the left visual field. So what's that going to do? That's going to activate your right brain. It's going to make it pop off at a higher frequency. And you can record this by just putting surface electrodes on your head. And you see the activation as captured in this particular kind of data analysis. But then you see through time, you see 100 milliseconds after the flash, 124 milliseconds, 148, through time, you see the electrical activity just be activated and the information transmitted from one part of the brain through the structure that connects the two hemispheres and over to the left. So you actually see and track and can know about how the place of the information being transferred and the timing it takes. And the lower picture, you see the activation sort of staying localized in the right hemisphere, because that's one of our split brain patients where that connection between the hemispheres has been cut, and so it can't get over there and it remains isolated in the right side. So so now we see, all right, we're beginning to see the tracking of information. We can isolate these things, and these are just exemplars. There's a million studies on this in humans and in animals and all the rest of it. When does it happen? This must mean that if the word potent, it takes time to get the information together. It must kind of actually happen before you're consciously aware of it. And that is a fairly common assumption, that information gathered over your body and over your sensory world has to come together and be assimilated, and we have to generate a moment, a sense that when we're consciously aware of our sensory sphere. And so you can do the experiment. You hold out your hand, you touch the tip of your nose, and there's a sense that your fingertip and your nose are being touched simultaneously, and yet the neuron from your hand is 3 feet long. It takes a long time to get up to your brain, longer. And the neuron from your nose is just a few milliseconds, a few inches long, and it takes a lot. It's carried much more quickly. But there's this sense that it's all happening simultaneously. So through all kinds of analysis, you realize the information is gathered, it's computed, and then it's kind of announced to your conscious life that these things happen together. And the notion that these happen after a delay was really first pointed out by a neurophysiologist, Benjamin Libet, a very clever man. And he made many observations, but in neurosurgery, there are times when people are operated on when they're conscious awake. The bone flap is off, they're given a local anesthetic, so they're conscious. And you can stimulate their brain and see how they respond to this stimulation. And what he discovered, make a long story short, is that you stimulate the part of the brain that would create a sensation in your hand, say, and it can take 350 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds after the stimulation has come on before you feel it. Well, what's going on? Well, it's going on. You don't know actually what's going on, but you see that delay. The information you know is there. You've hot wired it right to the top of the brain, but it still takes time. So there's this notion that things are happening, and by the time you're consciously aware of it, the brain's already done it. So this is sort of the context that so much of neuroscience is thinking about and considers. Well, okay, so what does it all mean? Richard Dawkins, the British evolutionist, says, well, let's take it what that means in terms of the problem of justice. And he writes, doesn't a truly scientific, mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense of the very idea of responsibility, whether diminished or not? Any crime, however heinous, is in principle to be blamed on antecedent conditions acting through the accused physiology, heredity, and environment. Or as he put, and then goes on, retribution, the idea of just deserts, punishment, and so forth. Retribution as a moral principle is incompatible with a scientific view of human behavior. That's pretty strong. That is a really strong view. I don't have to agree with it, and I'll show you why at the end. But he is not without his humor, and he called upon the British John Cleese to help him understand this concept that is so prevalent amongst all of us. And he wrote an essay called "Let's All Stop Beating Basil's Car." So this is a little little video I picked up from YouTube that captures a way of saying this notion that if everything is determined, if we're as mechanical as cars, why do we punish? I mean, if your car doesn't work functionally, you don't go out and beat it. Anyway, that's the idea, right? You try to fix it, and that's the idea here. So here is this fun video that gives you a chance to take a breath. Oh, you get the idea. So, so that is a very common view, that if we adopt this deterministic view, we have to rethink about how we consider punishment and justice and all the right. So these are big ideas, big important ideas. What do we think about? Well, the view, it gets worse in a sense. The view to how we think the brain is organized raises even deeper questions. And this, I'm going quickly and skipping over many things, but there are many, many famous neurologists, and the first people there were thinking about this were the Germans, the French, the British, the Scots, the Viennese, and so forth. And they all were pointing to a picture that the brain is a vastly parallel and distributed system. There are systems all over the brain. They're not in one place. One thing may be over here, one thing may be over there. There may be an interaction between the two things. And so you think of yourself and think of your brain as a population of centers that are involved in controlling what we think is our unified conscious reality. And while the original studies in the history of science of thought in the world were from neurologic cases, people who had strokes and who had lesions of one kind or another. All of that is, that kind of observation now is done in different ways, and people are studied differently through, say, functional brain imaging. And so this is a classic study done by Mark Rakel and Michael Posner, where they just look at what parts of the brain are active when you're hearing words and you see a particular pattern there, what parts are when you're seeing words versus hearing words versus speaking words versus generating associate words. And you just see this thing moving around. There's different parts of the brain. What seems to us kind of phenomenologically to be a unified process. So parallel and distributed seems to be the idea. And you think of this in this way, that these various dots represent well-established zones of brain area that when damaged cause certain behavioral disorders that you can detect. Any of you have had relatives who have had strokes, so you may have experienced these deficits, and you see. Or you can see these phenomena in normal people being selectively activated through these new brain imaging technologies. And what's interesting about that is those local areas also seem to be the areas that are active in enabling whatever it is you're talking about, whether it's the sensory world, whether it's a thought. When you're consciously aware of those, the processes that allow you to be consciously aware of whatever particular module you're thinking about seem to be right there, right close to it, anatomically, physiologically. And the reason that we sort of know that for me, came alive, and I'll show you in a second, when we studied these patients who had had their hemispheres divided, where the left brain no longer could communicate with the right brain. And after the surgery, the patients simply don't comment on the fact that they're no longer talking about, or miss, as it were, the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere doesn't miss the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere doesn't seem to care that it no longer can see the left half of space. And it's as if the consciousness for the left half of space is in the right hemisphere, and that's isolated from the left hemisphere. And it just is weird. It's weird. And so finally you go through an analysis and you think about it. You say, well, the things that enable consciousness of particular capacities we have must be very tightly anatomically related to their sight. And this has been, idea has been developed, and I won't go into the details, but just accept that at the time, for the moment. So all of this, though, with these multiple modules, these multiple systems divided all the brain, all of this flies in the face that kind of none of us believe it. We all think we're in charge. There's a you. There's a person in there calling the shots. There's a you, a self, or person, and there's a command center, a central system that is responsible for everything we do. We all think that. It's an overwhelmingly powerful phenomenon that all humans experience. So you have a freedom from causation. It's you that are doing things. You're not part of some causal change. When I move my arm out there, it's because I willed it, and that's just the way it is. And forget all this fancy science talk and the rest. And Dan Dennett, a famous philosopher who's also a man of great humor, pointed out to me that you can save yourself a lot of this time building up this dilemma that there's all these modules, but there's this sense of reality, because Hollywood already figured this out and was able to communicate it. And my last attempt at humor tonight will be to show you a scene from Men in Black.
Look at this.
What the hell is that?
There it is. The command center.
Must.
You get the idea. So we have it. Everybody has it. We're all sitting here enjoying it, have it. And so the question becomes why? Why do we have this unified sense? How can we think we have a narrative, a storyline that is just straightforward and continues on? Well, this is due to something that the students heard about last night, but briefly, something that we unearthed in the left brain, in all of our left brain. Everybody in this room has this thing. And it's called the interpreter. And it's something that seems to pull together the storyline that of all things happening and make a single narrative. And how we came across this was by testing these patients who have their brains divided in an effort to control their and forget that. And so just briefly, because it's redundant with the lecture last night, but for those who weren't there, these patients are people that had their brains separated in an attempt to prevent seizures from going from one side of their brain to their other brain. And that's the medical reason for doing it. And then I was part of the team that looked at the psychological aspects of what happens to these people. What would happen to you? Just think of this. What would happen to you if I separated your left and right brain? Well, it turns out, as I said, that any information going to your left visual field right brain would no longer be named by your left brain. So in this cartoon here, if I show you this cartoon and you look at the central dot, you would say to me freely that you have a picture of a snow scene and a chicken claw. And that's because your brain's connected and the big fiber between them is connected, and all this information gets over to your left hemisphere, and you can just normally name it. You're doing it right now as you look at that picture. Well, what happens if I disconnect your hemispheres and I show you that same pictures? What do you say you see? And these patients, the split brain patients, say they see a chicken claw. That's all they say. I just see a chicken claw. That's the effect. So the other information's over in the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere doesn't have a speech center, so it stays isolated over there. The left hemisphere says what it sees, the chicken claw. So then you say, okay, don't tell me. Do not say a thing you say to the subject. But I'm going to give you a bunch of choices, and you just point to the answer. So what happens is the chicken claw is associated with the chicken by the right hand, and the snow scene becomes quickly associated with the shovel by the left hand, right hemisphere. So now the patient responds like this, points to the appropriate objects, and you say, okay, why'd you do that? You ask the subject. And the patient says, oh, well, that's easy. This is the left hemisphere talking now, right? It's only the left hemisphere that's talking to you. It says, well, the chicken claw goes with the chicken. And then looking down at the left hand says, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. So they have to put together the story, build an explanation for the behavior that is coming out of that. And you then see, well, this can be true for differences in emotional states and the like. There's something in our left brain that starts a story going about why we do the things we do, why we behave the way we do, why we feel the way we do, the ever-changing thing. And it starts this personal narrative, this story. Lev Kusleshov, a famous Russian psychologist, developed a simple little test which has been used by filmmakers in Hollywood ever since. And it basically, what he did was show, he asked subjects to look at this face of the man on the left there. And then prior to showing them pictures of the man on the left, he would prime, as they were, by showing them either this baby in a casket, a very sad scene, a bowl of soup, a very neutral scene, or some seductive scene, and then show the man's face. Well, what he discovered was, so he's giving this test to people like you and me, if he primes us first with one of those other scenes, what we saw in the guy's face was totally different. And yet, in each test, it's the same face. So prior to us being tested on the face, he primes you with something that's going to bias your emotional system one way or the other. And you can do this very quickly. So Hollywood does this all the time, the movies guys. They want you to have a reaction to a certain scene, and in order to make it pop off the film, and you have the emotional, they've biased you to get your system going down a certain road. So this is, again, a film that just shows it, how they did it. So there's the bowl of soup. Okay, what's this guy, what's he thinking? We're supposed to come up and we write something. And then the same thing with this gas. You get the idea. So the interpreter is sitting there constantly trying to put together these fluctuating emotions which are being affected by the environment, by our experiences. They're biasing what we're going to do next, and we're tying that emotional arousal or disarousal to the next event, and we tell a different story and feel differently about what's going on, whatever it is. And so we are these, what's been called the story mind. This is what we humans do. We just tell a story, just love a story, just get the story out. And Graham Swift in his book Waterland says it nicely, I think. Animals live in the here and now. Only nature knows neither memory nor history, but man, let me offer you a definition, is the storytelling animal. Wherever he goes, he wants to leave behind not a chaotic wake, not an empty space, but the comforting marker, buoys, and trail signs of stories. He has to keep on making them up. As long as there's a story, it's all right. Even in his last moments, it is said in the split second of a fatal flaw, or even when he's about to drown, he sees passing rapidly before him the story of his whole life. Now that part is not true, because I had that happen once, and I thought, curtains were coming in an automobile wreck, and I did not see my whole life flash in front of me. I instead yelled an expletive, and that was that. I didn't run into it. But it's a story. We all know this. That's why we love fiction. That's why we're always building models, and we're seeing stories, and we love the stories. So to bring this all home, then I'll wind up on the implication of this for justice and fairness, and why I think ultimately we are to be held accountable for our actions. And these are the deep issues that every culture, every one of us individually, every person, every human has to think through these things themselves. It is not a groupthink thing. And when we want to think about issues in justice, we want to know that if someone has violated the societal norms, what do we do about it? We have ethical considerations, we have our rational approaches, we have the law, we have natural law, we have fairness, we have beliefs from religion and other equity issues. And the question is, this is all based on, what is our moral state? What do we think about fairness? What do we think about our moral impulses? Where do they come from? Are they all cultural? Are they all learned at mother's knee? Are they all learned from religion? What's going on? Well, we know we have them. We know we are an insistence on fairness. It's a very interesting thing. The economists have been studying this for years. And they play something called the ultimatum game. The ultimatum game is very interesting. Economists used to think that everything is just money. If you get more money, you do this. You get less money, you do that, right? It's just life's clean, rational choice, all that stuff. Totally wrong. That's not what happens. We are a species that demands other factors be considered. And so they play this game called the ultimatum game. And the ultimatum game is there's two people. One person has $20. And the other person has none. Okay? One person has $20, the other person has none. And the game is over after one remark. This guy, the guy with $20, either says 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, all the way down. Says one thing. And this guy only gets one answer, yes or no. So, in a simple world, if this person, if he wants any money out of this little game, he should always just say yes. Sure, he'll say yes if it's 19, 18, 17, but he should also say yes if it's 1 or 2, because the game's over after that. So if he doesn't say yes, the guy with $20 keeps the money. And if he says no, if he says no, the guy keeps the money. If he says yes, he gets some of the money wherever he stops. So you do this. Everybody in this room is the same. Do this. What happens? How do we humans respond to this game? Well, we get up. We don't say yes until about $7 or $8. Because if the person's only offering us $5, that's just not fair, right? And cutting off our nose and to spite our faces, we just say no, all right? So baseline activity, that's how all humans respond. And Ernst Fehr, a Swiss economist, now using all the fancy brain imaging techniques that we have, basically discovers that using a new technique where you can kind of stun the brain locally, it's called a transmagnetic cranial stimulator. You just put it on your head, you go beep, and it's kind of, like that. And the cortex underneath that is sort of takes a gasp of air, and while it's doing that, it's not functioning normally. So you move it around to see, during this ultimatum game, is there any part of the brain that affects the judgment? And sure enough, there's a part of the right frontal cortex that he can localize, that if you stimulate that, the subjects lower their sense of what is fair. They go from a $7 mean down to $3. So you have this, and you do the other parts of the brain, there's no effect. So there's a notion, therefore, that there, in the adult human, there is this sense of fairness that is there. Now the question is that built in, or did did we learn it? Is that just what happens in life? And so very clever psychologists, René Balgeron and David Premack, started examining this in small babies, in 12, 15, 16-month-old babies. And how these tests are run, I mean, these developmental psychologists are just super creative and fun. Their big expense items are toy giraffes. Big expense. They don't need the $5 million brain imaging device, okay? And so what they do, first of all, they take children and they show them these little scenes. So the babies are looking at what you see there, and then they're looking at the baby, okay? And in this particular example, they used these puppets on these giraffes in a puppet setting. So they looked animate and they looked live and they looked real. And the question is, how do the babies react to the dishing out of rewards, of goodies? And the babies were only content and happy in this situation when the experimenters distributed all the goodies equally to these two giraffes. If you gave one of the giraffes a second banana and not the other, they got upset and agitated. Okay? Now, to show that this is being triggered by something that's of an animate nature, they took plastic giraffes that were rigid and solid, the kind of stuff you buy at, circuses and so forth. And they did the same test. Now, the babies could care less. They didn't care who got the bananas. That's incredible, right there. It's right there. It's a response. So they kept pushing this thing. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, they didn't like that. Reciprocity, So they do a little test with the baby. The babies are again looking at this, right? And then it's real simple. You just see just like A, B. So they give a little game where A steals B's cookie. Baby's not surprised that B steals it back. Not surprised. They're surprised if something like that doesn't happen. Another one. Again, these are all abstractions shown to little babies, 12 months old, 13 months old. And this is a very clever one. A hinders B. So A is going to get in the way of B. Right? Hinders B. Now, B and C, you'll notice there, is a group. It's a group. B and C are buddies. Okay? So now, the babies just saw A hinder B. Okay? Babies are surprised if C helps A, so long as B and C are in the same group. So now, the babies have figured out, wait a minute, A hinders B, how can C go over and help A? I have fun with these PowerPoints. And what do the babies respond? Oh my, I can't believe that. He was over there and he helped the guy in the other group. And they're, he's kind of. And then this one, retributive from the beginning. A hits B, B hits back. The baby? Nothing interesting there. That's the way the world should be. So you see that the idea and they're arguing for and pushing is that these scripts are laid down in us. They're there and they get built on through years and modified by our beliefs and our rationality and our cultures and all the rest of it. But the amount of issues that and biases that we come with are enormous. So here's the puzzle. We know that brains enable minds and that you is your vastly parallel and distributed brain. There's really no ghost in the machine. So this gets down to this fundamental question. What does it mean to be free? And the answer that helps you get thinking about it is, well, wait a minute. Free from what? What do you want to be free from? When I decide to move my arm, I want that arm to go over there. I don't want it to go over there. You know, I want this thing to work like a Swiss clock. I want the laws of physics and chemistry to be working in a reliable, predictable way. And so when you think about it, maybe the brain isn't the place to be looking at this question of what makes us responsible and where is the seat of responsibility, personal responsibility. We don't want to be free from the forces that make for a natural, organic relationship with our environment. So maybe we've just framed this thing incorrectly for hundreds and hundreds of years. Maybe we should think differently. And what I would like to end with is a suggestion that we've been dealing with the wrong level here, and we can think about it this way. So think of cars. Cars are automatic, they're determined, they're physical systems. We know all about how they work, we study them carefully, and blah, blah, blah. They don't tell you a thing about traffic, right? In Abu Dhabi, I can tell you. I've learned about traffic. And so all the knowledge in the world, finer and finer knowledge of this determined machine, the car, is not help you at all figuring out how these bikes get around Gazzaniga. They miss each
By
other.
popular demand, here's some more
It's
traffic
another
footage.
level of organization.
The last footage
It's
I showed,
another
it was actually in Hanoi.
system of
Now
laws
I'm in
that
Da
we would
Nang,
have
which is
to
about half.
capture. So maybe the way to think about this problem is brains are not free. They work. We want them to work. Physical system, just like your liver, just like your heart. No one wants a free will heart, believe me. They want it to work. So brains are not free, but people are free. Now what does that mean? That means if there's more than one, it's the group. So if you take the idea of personal responsibility, which we all think about a lot, and are we being responsible and moral and all the rest of it, all of those concepts have no meaning if you're the only person in the world. Responsible to who? What are you talking about? You're sitting there on a desert island and that's it. Enter the second person. Now we're talking. There's people. There's the social contract. How are we going to arrange our lives? How are we going to guide the forces that work between this group? How are these interactions going to be understood? And what happens is the group comes together and they start developing laws and issues, laws and rules, and the sense of responsibility is really in the social group and in the interaction of the group. So don't look for it in the brain. Look for it in the social ether, as it were, between the interactions of humans when they get together and function. And I think if we do that, and even though we've gone through this whole scientific analysis and we live in this sense of cause and effect and determinism, it does not speak to the essential question that we're all interested in. Should you be held accountable? And I think the answer is clearly yes, because you've made a contract with your fellow members of your culture to do things in a particular way. So on that point, I'll end and thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. You're still willing?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Did I go
If
too long?
you could just wait until the mic gets to you before speaking, and then say who you are and if you're willing, where you come from and what you do, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Amit Khan. I'm a teacher here. I'm in Abu Dhabi. My question has to do with that part of the brain that you were calling the interpreter region on the left side. What is known about if there's damage to that area, or if you do that little experiment with the temporary disabling of that, what would happen then? And what do patients like that behave like when they don't have an ability to make a story?
Well, I didn't show you the area that is the interpreter story, because I know it's in the left hemisphere, but I have not been clever enough to figure out where, because we just haven't. It was something we'd have to capture in a brain imaging environment, and we haven't done it. So we know in the big terms, we know it's on this continent, not that continent, but I can't tell you what state it's in. Now there are other areas, other functions like that word form area, putting the information together to see the word. You can stun that part of the brain and disrupt reading very clearly. And then you take other issues. There's a part of your right hemisphere that is involved in monitoring the beliefs of the other person. So what do we do all day long? Is you're talking to somebody, you're building a model of them, and you're trying to figure out what they think about whatever it is you're talking about, right? That's why it's all social process, right? I mean, that's what the brain's built for. And you can disrupt that. You can make it not function normally by zapping a particular area. And so you find these various things, and then you test it, and then and then all kinds of observation, parametrically explore the timing and the relationship when a particular part of the brain may kick into an overall cognitive and blah, 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 blah. So yes, lots of fascinating stuff there.
You use the word consciousness, and I wonder what that really means. You say something happens at a few milliseconds and a few more milliseconds, and then at some point you're conscious.
Yeah.
What happens? I mean, is that a click? Is that a different point depending on the context? What is it?
Well, you get that, and you get 4 Nobel Prizes. People refer to it as, just simply refer to it as, without knowing about it, we can talk about it still, even though we don't know it. If you think about the gene, we were talking about the gene way before we knew anything about it. And as we said last night in another conversation, what we actually mean by it is continuing to change every year. But we know roughly what it is we're talking about. And that's how people have dealt with consciousness. And so observation I was rushing through there is that some people have built models that the brain goes about its role doing all these cognitive events, processing, and then it goes through some center that awakens you to it, and you're consciously aware of it. There's a consciousness box somewhere. And when I'm arguing for that, that's probably not how it works, that the enabling system, which is, I don't know what it is, no one knows what it is probably multiply represented throughout the brain and is associated with each of these specificities that we've been able to identify. So it's kind of like whack-a-mole or whack-a-kitty, and it pops up and one goes down, one goes up. And so what comes off as unified consciousness is actually these systems playing their tune at different times. And through time, it comes off as a unified whole. We saw that we see that in these split brain patients where a couple of the patients have learned to talk out of each hemisphere actually. And so when the patient is talking to you, you kind of really don't know which hemisphere is talking to you. That's because we know a lot about the patient's brain and where we put information. But in terms of the reality of the moment, it seems like total normal fusion, and there's nothing no one would know except us, right? So I think of it the same way. You take that, discovering it in others, and you apply it to yourself, is that there's this sense of unity, and this interpreter keeps his narrative going, but in fact, it's a bunch of pipes going off independently and get pulled together through time into a story that seems coherent.
In the Richard Dawkins' argument about the crime should not be punished, I think even if human beings are automated and just reactive, purely automatic, there's still argument of you kill the chicken to show the monkeys, right? It demonstrate to potential criminals that stop. You're not gonna get away with it.
Oh yeah, there's a million arguments, and I don't think anybody believes for a second. I mean, you can have a view on the extent of retribution you believe, light, not so light, whatever. What is absolutely everybody seems to realize is that if you get any kind of network, social network, computer network, any network, if there's an error in the system, if there's a cheater in the system, they have to be held accountable. Pull it out of the system. You can't have this cheater running around. The rest of the culture doesn't work. And so you got to pull the cheaters out, and whether you do that, you pull them out and you whap them, or you just pull them out, get them out of the. You're not interested in the punishment. You're just interested in getting the society to work in a normal way and so forth. Then people who kind of take that position say they're not saying you don't hold people accountable. They always try to make that very clear. You have to have accountability in the system. It's just what you do in terms of the sense. Now, this is so culturally different from other, as you move around the culture. In Italy, for example, there's, and it tends to be in the Catholic Mediterranean countries, where I know a little something about it. There's no sense of retribution. You're not supposed to punish. That is God's job. What you're supposed to do is re-educate. And so today in Italy, when a criminal is sentenced away, there's not a retributive aspect to it. It is that they're going to go into rehabilitation. They're going to go into some kind of repair. And I can tell you that's not how it's viewed in the United States or England or other countries. So so we have to distinguish between accountability and retribution and these other dimensions of the issues of justice.
Question there.
You mentioned that some people were able to develop like a speech center in the right brain, and sometimes it was difficult to tell which side of the brain was speaking.
Yeah.
Does conflict between the two different brains ever arise, or?
I assume it does. I mean, certainly conflict arises in all of us all the time. So there are processes for being of two minds. It doesn't have to be tied to that particular anatomy. But we have seen conflict between the hemispheres, as I think I again showed you last night in those blocks, where you had the definite conflict between them, which wasn't that common. But yes, I would say that you can capture moments of conflict. I know in another series of experiments where we asked each hemisphere to rate how they valued a bunch of things. And we test one hemisphere and we test the other. And the first time we did this, both hemispheres evaluated various sets of things we knew the patient was interested in the same way. Their likes and dislikes tracked each other. And then a month later, we retested that same patient with another set of stimuli. And the patient that day was very agitated, very kind of anxious and upset. And we put him in front of our machine there, and it turns out the hemispheres were differentially evaluating the same stimulus. So it's kind of like they were of two minds. One was approaching it, one didn't want it. So when you get into those tugs with yourself, you kind of get anxious. And sure enough, we just sort of saw it. So I think we saw it in this experimental situation, but I think that is probably a possibility going on, a mechanism, suggestive of a mechanism going on in normal students.
So you've mentioned multiple times about the role of the interpreter as the weaver of like many different thoughts and stuff.
Speak out a bit.
So if for some reason somehow the interpreter region got destroyed through a lesion or some physical damage, would we lose our like sense of self, our own narrative, and everything that like makes us us?
Yeah. So, are there disorders of the interpreter that lead to some manifestation? There are only suggestions that we can see things like that things like that can be identified. But I'll tell you what, because of the lateness of the hour, I won't go into them because it requires a whole setup. But the answer to your question, there is suggested evidence of that kind of disruption that occurs when you get damage to what might be the interpreter.
Question down here.
Well, can we relate the consciousness to the brain development and the cognitive development, the brain maturation and the cognitive development? Because we know that there's stages, the sensory motor when they're 1, 2, 3, and then that goes on.
Well, there's a this is a funny story. So there's this kind of, with all this brain imaging technology now, for the first time in human history, we can study normal brains and their connections. All you do is stick your head in one of these machines, and they can basically see the connections of the brain. And it all has to do with the machines capturing the flow of water in neurons. This is very fascinating physics and all the rest of it. To make a long story short, you can now do kind of a dissection of your own brain or anybody else's, but just put your head in the machine for 5 minutes, and they take the picture and they see the wiring. Okay? So there's a general storyline that your brain is not fully developed until you're 21, 23, whatever it is. That your neurons in your brain they're not fully myelinated, so there's going to be a change in the speed of conduction of information from one part of the brain to the other. And this got picked up and quickly talked about with some evidence that the difference between teenage brains and adult brains could now be explained because the teenage brains were not hooked up. So their impulsive behavior was because they didn't have their frontal lobes fully associated with other parts of the brains to inhibit behavior, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. And that's been around. Well, great thing about science is it just keeps coming at you. Just, keep reading the literature because there's another story right behind it. And this man, Gregory Burns at Emory University, says, okay, let's take a group of teenagers and study them. And we're going to have two groups of teenagers, those that engage in high-risk behavior and those that don't engage in high-risk behavior. And we're going to look at their brains, okay? And high-risk behavior included drug use, alcohol use, maybe early sexual activity, and so forth and so on. So that's high risk versus low risk. And then looks at their brains. What he finds is actually it's the high-risk kids whose brains are hooked up. And the low-risk kids' brains aren't hooked up yet. And so now, all of a sudden, kind of the funny thinking is that for teenagers that get into trouble and engage in high-risk behavior, it's an adult caught in a teenage world, and they're acting out. You don't think that's funny? That is funny. So it's just in a matter of a year, in this past year, all of a sudden people think, well, wait a minute, this is going to be a complicated problem, and we just can't have a simple relationship and figure out. So all that stuff's coming. It's all in the tube. It's all coming out. And over the next 20 years, the fascination, there's a project just launched in the United States called the Connectome. Is that kind of spooky? the connectome, and it's going to be a database that has all the normal connections of the brain. And the notion is that by analyzing what is the normal brain, you're going to understand subsets of people with disease, of schizophrenia, of manic depression, of maybe a reading disorder, and be able to see how one group brain is organized a little differently, giving rise to the disorder that is causing a problem in their life. And then knowing that network different, try to educate yourself about how it might be fixed through pharmacological agents and all the rest of it. It is so cool that these things are coming out, and they're big steps, but they're still baby steps. And so, but it's all happening, and it's all happening now, and it's the time to, excuse me, jump in and be part of it. So on that note, thank you, and let's.
Well, thank you, Professor Gazzaniga. I don't know if you can, this is a question I often ask myself, if you can physiologically measure tiredness in the brain. It's just that, yeah.
I've got a good measure of it right now.
Yeah, no, so anyway, you must be tired, but you've given us a real treat of a lecture.